Hello everyone, today we talk about travel in medieval France. Bit more of a thematic video. Many of you ask me like, why don't you tell us something more about, lifestyle, these kind of things. I actually don't like these topics just per se, but every once in a while it can be interesting, and of course it always gets down to how you tell the story, what aspect you can look at. So it's obvious that also this specific one is it's much wider than what I can resume today, because travel, journeys, communications, properly voyage. We're talking French here. Can be approached from a wide series of perspectives. Just think about the French Roman road of pilgrimage. Just think about all the political alliances that we have seen going on, in fact, between the French monarchy and the Roman papacy. The composite nature, culturally wise, of medieval France, and so literally the different types of kind of political and social development, and consequently of endemic and wealth distribution that definitely affected the communication system and so on. And this is a topic, of course, that we can approach for many different countries. So today I put together the stuff and see how it works. So naturally, a video on travel in medieval France has to start from the pre-existing condition of Gaul, say communication-wise, because as you know, this region historically, since Celtic times and eventually more with the Roman road system, was well infrastructurally served for Central European standards, right? There was a bit of a wilder north, of course, a central goal that, as we have seen also recently in that video about the Idoi, had an interesting level of proto-urbanization, of magistracy development before the Roman conquest that eventually was integrated, in fact, in the same imperial administration. There was a south that was colonized by the Greeks, a bit more in the hinterland by the Romans, even before the probably Caesar's times, but we're talking mostly about the coasts, right? And consider in this that all these peoples had been building, of course, like we all do, over pre-existing infrastructures of some sort, right? The Roman road system was of course more advanced than the Celtic one, but it still was based, obviously enough, on the Celtic road network, right? That over time had, from quite a while, where it's not just in Celtic times, you can observe even pre-Indo-European times. I mean, pathways gradually, expanding and eventually being consolidated and upkept, etc. It's obvious in such a massively populated region that has also lots of agricultural resources that need to be moved from place to place. This sense, the distribution of centers of cities eventually is quite rational, right? If you look at France, let's say today, as we will see now, because this started happening in the Middle Ages, France is Paris, right? But still, from ancient times, say Lyon and Marseille are the second most important cities, and basically by scale there's no other comparison in France, because historically, again, Paris, north of the Massif Central, this swallowed everything practically. There were many other cities, many other centers. We'll hopefully look at them also in my series about the historical regions and cities. And the distribution of these centers had been kind of rational, homogeneous. It's mostly a continental reality. There are some ports, and of course on the Atlantic, on the Mediterranean. And what you find is, however, mostly of course, a continental reality where the territory is dotted with some centers, more or less equally scattered, well connected by essentially almost straight roads that all irradiate from the center. So also politically and strategically, occupying France is somehow easy once you have, let's say, forced the block of whichever military is preventing you from taking control. And that's also partly how in fact, since in fact Celtic times, these were the most developed areas of the Celtic world. This is the reason why Gaul, by late antiquity, was essentially the most culturally advanced country in Europe. At least this is debatable, because Italy didn't kid either, but the Gothic War struck the peninsula. Definitely the Gallo-Roman society was the most culturally advanced, and the one that in fact also helped maintaining that kind of order under the Merovingians, and already before, because it was already well implanted. As I was saying before, there were different sub-regions within the same Gaul, of course, and so those should be taken into account. We'll do it perhaps a little bit later, especially as far as the north and the south are considered. And in medieval times, the French monarchy, I made a video specifically about this, took on an imperial character in nature, right? It's fundamentally this northern Languedoc monarchy that manages to systematically subjugate all the surroundings, unifying what had been partitioned in late Carolingian times as the Western Frankish kingdom, and essentially making this dynasty rule in a very hierarchically developed and socially stratified country, where mostly there were lots of oligarchs, right? Remember that medieval France had the highest level of, let's say, in fact, of wealth concentrated in the hands of few people, right? Like, unlike any other country in Europe, and incidentally was also the largest, richest, and most populated country in Europe in absolute terms. It was not necessarily the per capita wealthiest, but as a whole was, considering it was under de facto a single rule by approximation, at least by the 13th century, it was managed more or less in a unitary sense by retaining military a very sound control on all these various centers and their communication nets, right? Even if in feudal times this was subcontracting, of course, to the local lords, still the level of compaction of these principalities was state-like in fashion. So we see very advanced administration, right, and properly communitary control, right? The Romans had fundamentally started that. I mean, the Roman Empire was the first power to rule over Gaul unitarily, right? So this had required an easing of the communication for the sake of governance. That in Gaul, again, is excellent, because it's basically, after the Romanic Italic homeland, the single greatest success of Romanization per se. So that properly the city road system, all the various infrastructures, aqueducts, well, pretty damn well. Travelers benefited from such an immense network of surfaced roads, a high level of security, because Gaul was, there were revolts at some point, but compared to other provinces, it was a pretty stable area. That even when actually, like it happened during the empire of the Gauls, it was not meant to secede from the empire. It was just saying, okay, we have our good administration here, we make it work on our own, and basically the political goals of defense, especially at that point, are the same. Then Aurelian naturally thought of it differently, but showing, in fact, the high degree of civil advancement that these provinces had reached, right? There were various forms of vehicles by the late antiquity that had been developed especially for passengers and available for hire in the same Rome, right? The medieval period, however, was different. Of course, it saw many changes, including, of course, the political fragmentation, especially in the early Middle Ages, and also in the high ones, most of them, for which the traveling conditions changed significantly. In a pattern you can see basically almost all over Europe, in the areas that had not had the Roman government, of course, were just by default habituated to. And some of these new conditions began to become apparent already in the 5th century, right? A Gaul, as we were saying before, wouldn't undergo a significant structural damage in a critical sense. But of course, there was a shrinking of statal power, and as you know, so the imperial government lost the same territory at the point, so that the locals had to govern themselves on their own, right? As they had always been autonomous de facto, but at this point under, basically out on their own against threats, against invaders. The greatest problem had been somehow internal. Think about the Bagaude revolt, about just the spawning, like in Rome, total war of brigands, of forces that, in the absence of a strong government, could carry out something that had previously been unseen for centuries, including piracy, right? That truly hit the coast. I made some videos there about the Celto-Germanic piracy, explaining how that it was a whole kind of Viking era on its own before time that we somehow tend not to conceive in the same way. Of course, there were different things, but the mechanism, right, of the contraction of the big continental empire always naturally brought this greater disturbances. As a consequence, the Gallic roads became unsafe, and there was less trade. This say there's not necessarily an order in terms of the cause-consequence connection, right? Trade was becoming less because also international traffics were contracting. The local territories were becoming less productive. It had to do, and so the unrest, the brigandage, and the invasions, etc., were just cause and consequence of this. Because from one side, yes, they did cause damage for less resources to be there, but there had already been an exhaustion of resources by some degree locally, and mostly also for internal wars, by the way. So something that just called from other actors from the external. Meanwhile, early medieval government itself became itinerant because of the small number of officials, the paucity of royal resources, and the personal nature of loyalty. They are also all both cause and consequence of one another, right? The Germanic rule was based on this concept of constant military activity, fundamentally, and so a sort of an itinerant lifestyle just by custom of the war bands and the seigneurial retinues. And given that less resources were available and government was somehow less stable, a good way to increase, your resources was essentially to move with your retinue, your court, your treasure, etc., to various places of these vast territories. Of course, from one side, to live off the land, right, in a way that essentially would make the local communities wanting to host you at a time for essentially forging political connections with you as clients, right? And also for, in fact, controlling the territory, to spread, an awareness also of the continuity of the monarchy that, as you know, the Merovingians also had pretty deeply ingrained in French culture at some point, and with their mystique, with their veneration of blood per se, right? That was both a Christian and pagan prerogative of royalty. As you know, the Merovingian kingdom fragments, recomposes briefly by the time of Dagobert, then re-fragments again, fundamentally to 4 different kingdoms that were all kind of like more or less France is a square, you can think, and they were in fact cutting it in four blocks that all were bordering with each other. And so this still was possible, by the way, due to, in fact, this almost geometrical distribution of the most important centers, of how they were connected still by roads that had declined, as we will see now. And the itinerancy of the courts naturally would last for an important amount of time, right? Almost a millennium, if you think about that. Of course, already at this point, the various Merovingian lords were centered in a specific centers. I mean, Paris, Rheims were already important. They had already acquired that kind of prestige over time, especially in this Merovingian ruled space, as opposed to the more kind of Romanized Lyon, and even beyond that, towards the Mediterranean, it was even difficult to reach, especially when the power was split, like we said, and the general role of Paris was immediately significant, except the actual mansions where the Merovingians lived were in the countryside, and some of them would kind of remain even later times, Carolingian times, mostly because, again, of this constant military activity that the Franks were also boosting on the base of the Gallic latifundian. That system was essentially making the tribal system evolving towards a more professional one, right? And in that sense, the Roman infrastructure, especially in this northeastern area where the Capetian monarchy also would develop on in a territorial sense, was historically the one where the estates that were used to supply the Roman legions on the Rhine were located. So most of all this was inherited by the Merovingians infrastructurally. So encapsulation was also not just happening in Viking era; it already existed at this time, especially when political rule was fragmented. You wanted to control the various centers of power. This would give rise, as we'll see now, to a lot of bridge building. These were indeed some of the most active areas of Europe, especially as far as an elite governance was concerned. So, even greater distances for military expeditions were covered. There was, as I was just saying, an early development, all of a logistical and supplying system that would be best exemplified in Carolingian times, where literally the local lords had all a base of magazines, of supply centers, of stations where they could stop and move an army in an incredibly quick time for the times and places across Europe, hundreds of kilometers, to join with the royal army to make effectively the Carolingian military machine that we know. It wasn't just that, right? The communication system remained active also thanks to the church administration that had, in many cases, had inherited the Roman one, right? And they were the same families, basically. The Gallo-Roman senators very often becoming bishops, and also counts as they married into the Merovingian aristocracy as well. So major landowners that thus were quite careful in administrating this already well organized and concentrated infrastructures since Gallo-Roman times, plus the importance that pilgrimage started acquiring at this point. Of course, pilgrimage mostly towards Rome. So important contacts between the Roman Church, the Milanese one, the Lyonese one, and further north that arrived as far as Britain. And so this important axis remaining one of, in fact, if not properly the major one of European pilgrimage and of lot of cultural exchange and political connection and management. I mean, these are the same centuries in which the Pope organized from the other side of Europe the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, the establishment of their church. So we're talking about, and all mediated by the secular authority in this. In a world that still reasons, by the way, largely as the Roman Empire is still there, right? The Merovingians do everything to, of course, self-legitimize themselves. Also, as far as the Roman ideology was concerned, they obtained the vicary of the Gauls. They have this privilege, preferential connection with the Roman papacy that is something actually affirmed much before Carolingian times. Basically, everything the Carolingians boasted was a Merovingian thing. They did their great work in making you believe otherwise, but it's still just they were continuing along that pattern. And of course, there is a lot there which is properly, quite advanced and quite successful, right? So the Romans, of course, had been famous mostly for their roads, infrastructurally, right? There are beautiful, think about the Pont du Gard, other, the aqueducts, other vestiges. The most important Roman centers do not die, right, in spite of the generalized decline of the system. However, what really becomes important as far as communication in France was concerned in early medieval times and beyond were bridges, right? Bridges acquire a primary importance in the Middle Ages for a very specific reason. So the decline of the Roman infrastructure had mostly occurred because of the lack of money to upkeep it, right? There is no mega empire anymore, thus the resources available are for major infrastructures that manage literally also to modify nature to just offer the best viability there, collapses, right? So given that the system more or less fragments in a set of local seigneuries, all these seigneuries, as we've seen before, tended to fortify themselves because they were, in relative terms, also more exposed to tax rates, whatever. France, as you know, is a land rich in rivers, in water, right? This is also a great part of the agricultural output comes from, together with the Atlantic current that mitigates the climate and beyond. So it's a very favorable and kind of privileged area. And these resources must be protected so that even passages, the waterways, and also the smaller ones are gradually fortified. And the bridges are born like this. I mean, of course, it was primarily a reason of mobility behind that. But important in this is that as you are, as a local ruler, able to upkeep the bridge, which costs a significant amount, you also want to make money out of that. So in the absence of a larger power, the locals kind of try to build this power from the lower levels, right? There are some areas of Europe that remained like this until the 19th century. Think about the Zollverein at the time of the German unification, all these German states that literally had, some told to require to traverse their to cross their boundaries, and that all of a sudden were eliminated. Naturally, this takes a long time because the local communities are not happy with that, because they want to keep essentially slowing down the entire thing if they can personally, individualistically maintain some kind of revenue from that. But in terms of broader power, this is something that modernity wiped out. We're talking here, however, about the Middle Ages, so this is actually the peak of that kind of fragmentation, which doesn't mean, by the way, that it was just like there was no sovereign authority. It was always a monarchy. There was always also an empire, technically, at least in France, directly controlling at some point. But as you know, as we've seen many times in post-Carolingian times, the fragmentation involves literally the creation of countless seigneuries that rule essentially some properly local territories and nothing more. Beginning in the 11th century, which so much more resources available, also especially now masonry is kind of increasing. Building before is just mostly moat and bailey, you would argue, and mostly, in fact, organic material. Bridge building became a piecework, right, on the grounds that, for example, it saved lives in times of flood. It just opened properly the world to itself once again, and it became again a great system of political and territorial control as well. The enthusiasm for bridge building meant that by the early 14th century, so the peak of medieval civilization, and the moment in which actually France had compacted dramatically, the country had in fact been provided with an impressive network of bridges that just before the crisis kicked in definitely connected France also far beyond. At this point, the French have literally an empire that stretches from the Channel to the Aegean Sea, passing from Naples. Southern France, it has been brought under in the previous century. So this infrastructure goes beyond localism. It has been assuming kind of taking on a kind of a regional scale of some sort, and this can be admired in many cases as some bridges were built on difficult sites, and naturally would allow what before nobody had the possibility of achieving. However, construction and maintenance, soon also with the 14th century crisis, brought to another collapse because money ran short, workers as well. Simply would have not made sense at that point investing so much in those infrastructures. For example, if trade routes were changing, right? The usual one connecting Britain, Flanders, the Champagne fairs, the Rhone Valley, Tuscany was by the 14th century shrinking dramatically. That's also an infrastructure there declined with lots of things, right? That's why eventually the French state consolidates in the north, also because it was closer to the frontier, it had received more pressure. It was just the one from which the monarchy had been ruling from the beginning of the Middle Ages, and that's where, in fact, that it's also more of a flatland, right? So, aside from bridges with important rivers that are flowing, in fact, now quite wide and distantly from the mountains, right? You have that kind of necessity, but it's also easier to build there. Travelers at the time would inform themselves whether such and such bridge were passable at any given time, because if you, of course, know there is warfare going on, like an English chevauchée, etc., first of all, you wouldn't travel. There were indicators that would tell you where or how to go, but people had to travel anyway, even under these circumstances, both locally and kind of continentally. Thus, the viability of these bridges remained always a matter of important concern. That even in spite of the crisis, late medieval civilization did not literally collapse, right, and had to be rebuilt from scratch, right? Mostly, this is a time of further re-encapsulation by a degree, but by also a scale that was unprecedented, as the crisis brought at this point all the various centers. In part, yes, France fragmented, but The local communities were hit to the point that they conferred more power to the local lords to consolidate even a further political territorial control, and we are on the eve of properly modern state building. So the actual means of control of local infrastructures increased by an important degree. As we already hinted at, during the Middle Ages, the orientation of the network of French roads changed. In Roman times, it had centered on Lyon, right? Because this was truly the frontier between northern and southern Gaul, was an important center, properly restructured to give an image of Augustan power, and it was at that time the most important center in Gaul. This area would end up being controlled by the Burgundians in late antiquity. Generally speaking, the most important center in the area switched south to Arles, that actually became the prefecture of the Gauls from Trier, Augusta Treverorum. Today it's Germany, but at the boundary at the time between, in fact, in Gaul, with Germany. And yet at the same time, we've seen Merovingian power compacts further north, and that's what eventually the Carolingians kept doing and the Capetians kept doing in a macroscopic scale. Thus, this is the moment in which, under the Capetians specifically, the roads in France came to lead to Paris. Right, this was just a normal consequence of the monarchy's gradual expansion in power. Right, this was just a place where now the kings were residing more often, where they started building their palaces, their administration, and also in a context in which Northern European economy was reviving significantly and acquiring, as I explained in a recent video, also for the first time a truly relevant place in European trade. So Paris was very well located because the Seine just flows in the channel. The North Sea was pretty active at this point, and in spite of the problems that naturally could arise politically, such as the Normans settled in the lower Seine valley by the same Western Frankish kings, and the various struggles that would flare throughout all the Middle Ages between France and England accordingly in the region. Well, this massive northern French system, with the exception of Brittany that technically wasn't even French, and Flanders that enjoyed some degree of autonomy, gravitated around Paris. Like all the major principalities that had formed in high medieval times were absorbed by the Capetians. They became ruled by the acquired peerage of France, which meant that they were simply ruled by the king's relatives, and thus safely compacted under monarchic rule, even as the major, as we've seen, agricultural and demographic pools that they were. Again, a rigidly hierarchical society organized in a feudal fashion that was stratifying literally the various the governmental ladder for an increased an enhanced control properly on this land masses and the communities inhabiting on them, right? Only one system of rivers led to the capital, by the way. Yes, there is the Loire, that is a bit the boundary, in fact, between northern and southern France, that doesn't witness the development of major centers that are basically all controlled by the monarchy. So the Seine Valley is the most important one as far as the monarchic government is concerned, and from there other valleys were controlled with all their income and so on. The direction of the routes may have had something to do with the concentration of travelers on land routes. Of course, evidence shows that only if the entire journey were between points on the Seine River, as on the Loire, downstream on the Rhone between Lyon and Avignon, were travelers tempted to take a boat. It was actually not quicker, right? If one had already hired one's horses, it was also more expensive to pay for the river travel in the first place. So this naturally depends on which systems we're looking at, but it's an interesting take at the matter, which means that roads worked well. They were efficient. Towards the late Middle Ages, there's probably a paving system that is becoming fundamentally necessary for the scale of trade and state administration required to make such territorial polities work efficiently. Methods of travel likewise shifted between ancient and medieval times. In late antiquity, the favorite and most prestigious conveyance was the carriage, right? Beginning in the 5th century, however, more and more people rode on horseback. And by the 8th century, mentions of carriages are rare, right? So much that actually in the 9th, in full Carolingian times, passenger vehicles as such had, if not disappeared, at least we don't see them in the sources. And for a king or a warrior to ride in any type of vehicle was considered a disgrace. Naturally, the system had become somehow more primitive, more rural. People traveled more rarely on greater distances than before. The system was somehow more self-contained, and the political culture of the rulers was much more kind of warlike in nature. Properly, as we've seen, the development of a de facto professional cavalry had brought the establishment that had, as we've seen, an incredible amount of personal wealth concentrated in their hands, brought them to just have enough resources to be full-time horse riders, right? Because they were warriors. They fought, as we've seen many times, every damn year of their life. I mean, the only times the ecclesiastical chronicles register some changes is the year in which a war had not been fought, because for the rest it was completely normal. So the standards of value, of physical fitness, of horsemanship that a Frankish leader had to hand, of course, and his role in society brought him to travel, particularly and efficiently, mostly on horseback, right? There was not like anymore a system just uniformly static in which you could simply have carriages moving for, even just for particularly long amounts of time, just fully standing, right? There were always this kind of thousands of armored warriors with all the supplies, their retinues, and so on, moving constantly. And that was a system that had simply to self-perpetuate itself all the time, because they were constantly involved in warfare. And you don't fight with carriages, you fight on horseback. And that is part of the reason why at least we don't see much passenger vehicles anymore at this point. It just, you had to be a horseman if you wanted to lead anything. Only if you were ill or old, you were excused in your failure to mount your steed. And of course, there were wagons that were used different times. The Saint Charlemagne used them, but mostly for carrying stuff, right? Not for moving. right? Just if you were ill, right? For example, when he suffered a stroke before his death, like he was, of course, carried away with some other means. But let's say these were mostly just for logistical use, not for just carrying people themselves. Consider that cavalry was not even intrinsically speedier, right? They had to move with wagons anyway, right? So the speed actually of cavalry strategically is even sometimes even less than one of infantry, as one wouldn't think, because the equestrian mobility is just tactical in nature. It doesn't have much of a strategic one unless you're not, carrying out kind of raids, skirmishes, or something like that. But an entire army, an effective strategic force has to move with wagons, and without that, you can't move in the first place. So you would be slower anyway. So in France, where this aristocratic ethos was more imbued than in any other country in Europe, given, as we've seen, the incredible social stratification and vertical order that existed, nobles and knights continued, at least until the 15th century, to move on horseback, right? Only when the king made ceremonial entries, he would ride in a carriage, right? On the other hand, by the 13th century, it was permitted and actually required that queens and duchesses should each own 2 gorgeously decorated chariots, one for their own and one for their ladies' use on ceremonial occasions, right? So it was the equivalent of the man retinue, and so for the woman a carriage was appropriate instead. And most of this had to do again with the ceremonial importance of the so-called entrée, so the entries into towns, because as we've seen, the courtly itinerancy was still there, would remain practically until the early modern age, and entering a city for the reasons of still that had gone on throughout the whole millennium for the local communities to competing for hosting the king and other high nobility, would organize kind of a spectacle, right? They would welcome these guests in the most sumptuous ways, and consequently also the king had to show on that occasion, not to be less. That was quite important, and this generated, of course, income for lots of people, because these carriages, say for example, had to be built, the king had to pay on it. So this reflects the general wealth that circulated at that point. And consider these noblemen were, as we've seen, extremely rich, but they constantly needed money, right? They were always struggling actually to satisfy their needs, because these were required by the same community to show, right? So they weren't actually swimming in gold and preventing this to circulate. On the contrary, they always were notoriously short of money in spite of the huge amounts that they acquired and spent necessarily. So hardly actually a parasitic system, as classists would want to make you believe. It is also obvious that throughout the entire Middle Ages, carts and wagons were used over long distances by, for example, the aforementioned tenants of great abbeys to carry produce, and or just the military equipment. Wine, lumber were, frequently traded goods either to the convent or to fairs. So there was definitely in this very, again, mostly agricultural space, a lot of goods that were moved constantly to maintain the courts, to maintain the populated, concentrated populations, and so on. In medieval times, there were technological improvements in travel and transportation too. The shaft cart, for example, little used in antiquity, became common in this millennium instead. The stirrup was introduced from the Avars in early medieval times and gradually adopted by the Frankish, mostly by the military, but it was used sometimes just as since the beginning. I mean, as an auxiliary mean, even just for children to teach them how to ride and this kind of things. Later we find nailed-on horseshoes, which in antiquity had not existed, right? Thus, actually the grip of the horses increased dramatically, and that's also how they actually made it easier to travel just on horseback. Equally, the harnessing of horses in tandem, improved horse collars, etc., were introduced and affirmed, right? During the 14th century, suspensed carriages appear in France. We have enough iconographic evidence to observe, finally, the undercarriage of chariots represented, so that we can prove how the pivoted front axle was in common use already by that time. Consider that it was known also in Hallstatt times, in the Celtic period, during the Roman times. However, how widely it was employed, given this lack of iconographic evidence, is difficult to determine before the 14th century. Right? So this is a proof that, of course, there's a pattern which things develop, but sometimes if they're not represented, if there is some specific cultural reason why that, the type of source will not reproduce these objects, we may not know the necessary about them. Despite these advances in traction, riding on horseback remained popular, and it seems to have been preferred to riding in vehicles still. Still, we tend to read history of technology like, this thing was introduced, and so it was kind of the most updated thing. Everybody wanted to substitute it. Actually, wasn't the case, right? Until the Industrial Revolution, like most, and even after that, changes were very gradual. But properly, that even the concept that a technology could fix or bring things or bringing them to a new state was unknown, because the world, of course, had never been working like that, and wouldn't for quite a long time, and technically doesn't work like that even today when we think that everything is about technology, but it's really not. Some of the most important improvements were made, for example, in horse breeding. Right, France was again the seat of the flower of European cavalry at this point. They were all about horses, right? They were literally fixated with that. It was true also for the Gauls in pre-Roman times, but at this point, feudalism had reached an extent that allowed as of a military culture to develop on the base of magnificent breeds. Naturally, there were various types. The trait was just like the giant, right, and the war horse, and the single most expensive one. It was strong enough, in fact, to carry a knight in full plate armor, and it also, sustained him in very specifically straining moments of combat, right? It was mostly designed for power, as you know, so it wasn't quite actually of a traveling horse. It was mostly the palfrey that would make the saddle horse with a comfortable ambling gait used in most transports. There were roncines as well, and here we cannot even descend just in the actual breeds, but we can maybe do that in another video. In any case, we will cover these differences for our historical military units series. Palfreys and the trait were actually luxuries, right? And many all-purpose horses continued in use as mounts and as plow and draft horses naturally. Because as you understand, even traveling was not for everyone, right? We actually underestimate how much people traveled in that time, but of course there was an important divide depending on who you were. If you were a peasant, normally you wouldn't have traveled for most of your life. You just have moved, to the closest market and a few places elsewhere, unless you weren't conscripted for military service or displaced. You would migrate, to another place, right? Because your lord told you to go farm another land. But it was full of people who traveled in these spaces. And again, I would argue that in France, especially at that higher level, there was kind of a higher range because the sceneries were just more extended, and so there was kind of a higher kind of working there. In the higher spheres, throughout the Middle Ages, as we know, it was common for pilgrims to walk, for they were believed to acquire additional merit if they performed their pious journeys on foot and especially barefoot, right? Just like Christ, that at best would travel on donkey back. In the Gospels, poor folk and servants were frequently pedestrians. This again was normal, just knowing how to ride, even affording a horse, especially because many people definitely knew how to ride. Wasn't that kind of a complicated thing to learn how to in certain contexts, but for which use, right? The point of people who rode on a regular basis is that they could afford that activity with somebody else paying for them. Also because horses were very costly, as we have pointed out many times. In southern France, in the 14th and 15th centuries, if an official hired a horse to make a journey to transact town business, for example, he was accompanied by a groom on foot to take care of the animal. You had to pay for the animal, had to pay for the guy. You had to pay for, in fact, whichever services you had to enjoy during the travel. So there were naturally also foot messengers. However, mounted courier would be kind of the standard, especially in northern France. Right? It's possible that those greater spaces, greater also fuel connections again would increase kind of the delivery method, also because it was the closest to the center. So people who wanted to know anything, like in a few weeks, they could simply pay for it and knowing it all over Europe, right? So the myth that news didn't travel fast, it's BS. Literally, you could send a message across Europe in a few weeks at most. It just took to pay. And of course, the majority of people would receive news in a very different way, right? But who had the money, not even so much compared to the other broader expenses for, say, making war and knowing all this info in time, would simply pay these guys. In southern France, the idea is that it was kind of a more urbanized reality, so a less feudalized one, so there were more commoners. The people were wealthier per capita wise, but there was also less political compaction locally. So also travels were probably less necessary because there were less. Naturally, today we're not even talking about merchants, for example. Those traveled far and wide, as you know. But in general, the communications were somehow more mediated and more efficiently so, and simply the jurisdiction of certain lords was smaller than in the north. This is not always true, right? Of course, if you pick the Dukes of Aquitaine throughout an important amount of time here, they were as powerful as the ones of the north. But in general, like the average person, if we can say, we have the case of mixed companies of horsemen and pedestrians as we were saying before, that actually on the longer run, unless you have properly stations where you can exhaust the horse that can run 150 kilometers per day and you pass to the next one. Normally, if you were an average traveler, you would normally maintain a speed of at least 30 miles a day over a period of several days, by the way. That is the same speed that armies had, right? It is the same speed the Roman legions had back in the day. So certain things really never change, and there wasn't, in this sense, even much of an actual mobility problem in the Middle Ages compared to ancient times. Like, if one looks at the essentials of it in that regard, it was other things that, primarily from a political point of view, have changed. They would make travels on average, if not shorter but less frequent, at least something that was more local in some nature. Also, let's consider hospitality, because in medieval times, and traditionally so, the idea that the traveler may be some kind of Christ or Odin in disguise is pretty notorious. Like, there was a very different sense of community from the one we have now. People, of course, were interested in outsiders for, say, positive or negative reasons. There was a general sense of cooperation given the community strains of the time, and so also a corporative sense that brought people to interact with other communities in this way, right? Hospitality could pay you back at some point in life, because, saying, okay, I want to be friend with you, and let's not kill each other, as it could easily happen at the time. Was a way to strengthen bonds, to pacify, to prevent bad things to happen, as it did happen anyway. The church had historically had the particular duty to provide with hospitality. That the church, also considering that in France, like in almost all of Latin Europe, the center of the diocese was the city, so that's also where more people come from the countryside to live off the city surplus, some sort. But generally speaking, the idea of the beggar, the traveler, whoever, the drifter, was normal, right, in medieval times. It's just, let's say, in the modern age, with an increased order, with the homogenization also of kind of effective administrative standards, the need to also stem the ever greater systemic shortcomings of the community brings these figures to be considered negatively, to be marginated, to be sometimes imprisoned, and or properly removed, right? Either forced in the army or in the navy. We think about the press gangs and so on, to get rid of them practically. In Middle Ages, travel was just like the metaphor of existence. That was the crusade as an armed pilgrimage, as it was just like the concept of the adventure. Consider that medieval times, whichever community you belong to, normally you were, as we said before, to remain within that for life, right? Even cities, as very international centers, still consider their world within the city gates themselves, and the outer side was just something else. It's just like in Gothic cathedrals that in France, of course, have their greatest development, together with England. You see how properly the idea of an internal order and of an external monstruosity, right, with the gargoyles, with these other symbols of evil that outside can happen. It's the sense that you are inside, you're safe around some walls, around your fellow company, and you may never know who the outsider is and what is going to happen. So it's psychologically, we could also try to make some videos, because understanding history is often about the mindset, right? And life was much harsher at the time than today, in not just in physical ways, but primarily in moral ones. So the church was also, as you know, a connective fabric of medieval Europe, abbeys, monasteries, right, that were sometimes isolated, but never quite in the sense that it had to be properly separated from the world. The monks did travel way more often than we usually think. These centers were also used just for the travelers themselves, for the nobility. I mean, it was normal, if you were a nobleman, you were on the move, to stop at some point in a monastery along the way, right? Abbeys built visitors' quarters and housed their guests according to rank. The great nobly and pilgrims and wayfarers simply. So there was a concern, naturally, that this could affect the community in some way. So there was actually a very efficient way of dealing with these eventualities, but it was normal to provide with some, again, service in exchange of some proximity. It was a clientelar system at large, as you understand. There were special bonds between the king and particular institutions. The same goes for the nobility. I mean, if you had founded a monastery yourself, or it belonged to your family historically, of course you could use it just by custom in much more accessible way that somebody else could do, etc. By the 13th century, a favorite charity was the foundation of hospices for the ill and the aged, and for pilgrims, wanderers, indigent travelers, etc. Right? That's also how it's a sort of welfare system, a voluntary one largely, but also funded with, the establishment's resources, mostly, in fact. And this had some hygienic function as well, because the xenodochia, the hospitals, were meant also to treat the sick and so on. The kings of France were entertained by their officials, by churchmen, and by various towns as well that were also pretty, competitive with the other elements to rise their status, because they weren't the nobility as such, but they would, especially towards the end of the Middle Ages, become integral part of the institutional order with the Bonneville de France, etc. Evidently, the communes felt that it was a productive investment, but officials and some churchmen attempted to procure documents exempting them from this honor, because it was a way just, for the kings to rely on them, and sometimes even in an abusive way, right? As long as, especially, who could ask was too powerful, and, saying no would compromise the relationship with such a high figure. Well, there was a sort of reliance of the monarchs on this, right? Most of the French king's travels seem to have been from one of their castles to another. A function of the castles was, of course, to serve as logistical centers, and just having an abode for the king, an adequate one, that could host the court and maintain it for a certain amount. Royalty offered foreign dignitaries hospitality in castles as well, sometimes provided with all the furnishings and food, sometimes not. This depends really on the situation, but we're talking about huge expenses also just maintaining castles on their own, as you know. French kings and nobles employed a household official that was the Arbinger to travel ahead and arrange for quarters, food, and fodder. In other terms, this person just anticipated the king on the march, and so where the court could be lodged, and he would simply oil the local communities, would pay them, etc., to kind of make the sovereign finding everything ready by the time of his arrival. Naturally, there were also much kind of more far-ranging negotiations, as there were visits to other countries, an exchange of, cooperations in this regard. The Harbinger would ensure the provision of sufficient bedsteads, especially, but also collecting from the neighborhood an adequate supply of mattresses, straw, feather beds, sheets, and cushions, which sometimes were just essentially taken without too much of permission. Of course, this is also partly the advantage of the ancien regime. There are lots of prerogatives that just the king has, right? Traditionally, the fodder was in fact the most important one, like having the fodder for the horses when the king was passing, because that had to facilitate properly the defense of the country and so on. It had transformed into properly a logistical system, very well organized all over the country since Carolingian times, but before too. But if you were just passing by, in some places, you could simply grab stuff. I mean, just think about the power, I don't know, of the Carpathians at the beginning of the 14th century. We just made a video the other day about this. Well, as they moved, just the news traveled, and everybody would get things ready, right? Because it was just an opportunity, again, to exploit, to be remembered by the king. Just think about, this king's always on the move, and how much that affected even their awareness of the realm, as opposed to people who mostly just lived in a single place. It's important for a ruler to know that much of this country. And often people were raised in different places. At least here we're talking about France, not just as properly whoever ruled only in France. I mean, think about the Angevins, think about the Normans. I mean, many English kings were raised in France, in different places, so they were more like from those places sometimes than the one which they would come to rule more permanently when they were raising to power, effectively, right? There was also all an aesthetics and artistry. I mean, tapestries were hung before royalty's arrival. The places would be transformed into courts, even just in terms of presentability, of level of decorum, and so on. Naturally, for travelers, inns existed. These were frequented literally by everyone. This is what one of the few things that are gotten right in the astonishing amount of RPG games background that people interested in the Middle Ages for some strange reason have. It's the of the adventure of this kind of also gloomy Middle Ages, of this travelers arriving late in the darkness and asking for wine or something to eat. It's you may consider that there is no tracking in this world of who people are normally. That there aren't modern kind of identification means. Even the monarchs can be in disguise. So that this is what, again, would fuel also that sense of you may never know who's in front of you. Literature is full of these allegories, or meeting, again, Christ as much as the devil. It would be an adventure, definitely, to travel at the time. It would man you up in many ways. Even royalty found the accommodations at some inns adequate. Some were run by pretty effective businessmen who had a lot of wealth, especially in the late Middle Ages. There were some kind of hotel chains, like today, fundamentally. They would make lots of money. This would be especially in the major cities, but it was still a way, in fact, to enter the higher spheres, because as you know, these cities, these centers were always ruled as a sort of private property of the guilds or something. So these would be the same people who would provide cash for the monarchy in times of need in exchange for interests, and or paid in different ways, also in infrastructural ones, like paying, maybe getting the tolls from somewhere. And so everything was connected to travel in so many ways. Doubtless after the king's harbinger had seen to it that the furnishings and provisions were what they should be, naturally, because there are certain, I mean, if you are, I don't know, a Charlemagne, you would probably be surprised by how frequently you would have had to just to sleep in pretty modest places. After all, if you're talking about 15th century French kings, well, those really had a much more kind of refined lifestyle, but we'll probably find it kind of Spartan for our standards today, right? We made a video about Louis XI last autumn, in which we observed how but it was a political move, would even choose kind of modest, almost mercantile clothes, and have a somehow modest lifestyle, just to show the nobility how arrogant they were, and trying to connect with, for example, in fact, the guilds, etc., in actually centralizing policy. The people in modest circumstances ate at the landlord's table, but travelers with a servant frequently bought food and firewood from the innkeeper, and the servant cooked the meal. This custom enabled persons seeking favors, as we've seen, from government officials to entertain them in a suitable style, etc. The provisions so purchased sometimes lasted several meals, by the way, because this would have had also to be carried with them during the travel. At inns, a noble would sleep in a bed in a private room, less important people on pallets in the main room, and grooms frequently on straw in the stable with their charges. During the 15th century, some of the peculiarly medieval values that had given prestige to travel in France began to decline. Actually, in this period, France was somehow remounting in power, especially after the mid 15th century, for the end of the 100 Years' War, etc. However, Europe had compacted in a kind of more distributed fashion. Like in the early 14th century, France really was the center of Europe in many ways, and or at least one of the most sought after destinations. Think about this, the theological studium of Paris. That was the most advanced in Europe. But just think again, all that international connection of noblemen really ruling over a large part of Europe, not just France, from this country. This was no more at the time. For example, the same Roman Curia didn't have the same reasons to go to France, because many of the appointments to offices and much of the litigation formerly decided there were now determined in the same France because of Gallicanism, etc. As you know, at this point, the papacy had come back to Rome from Avignon. That was, yes, in the south. It had also kind of a broader central meaning. It was not just France per se. It was the boundary between the Holy Roman Empire and France. In fact, it would be maintained by the papacy also until late in the modern age. But let's say that states were also kind of compacting to become self-sufficient after the universal powers that also France had aimed at had somehow been redimensioned on a more national base. France, generally speaking, was also, like, while the Renaissance was emerging in Italy, also spreading in other countries that had important monarchies, etc., France remained very advanced, definitely, but also in this sense very imperially oriented. I mean, the real power of France was in its military, in its capacity to expand. It was definitely a cultural superpower still, and it did have, as we've seen, thriving cities, etc. But at this point, the Ancien Regime all over Europe had, especially in France, had somehow crystallized also the social differences. Like, majority of the people was now completely removed from kind of a truly representative political power, was not much there to play anymore. And so largely what France was is what their kings did, right? Which, also for the sake of ruling over such an extended and populated territory, required some authoritarian means that other countries didn't quite have, right? Pilgrims had been objects of charity because they were engaged in pious missions, and students in studying at French universities had been a cause of pride because of the Frankish road crossing the country from Britain to Rome, or also the path of Santiago in Spain, also beginning from France, etc. Also, France had been connected with, mostly as we've seen, the important centers like Flanders, the Rhineland. It had this constant exchange with England and with the Mediterranean. Now, pilgrims, as we were saying before, the threshold of the modern age, began to be classed with vagabonds. The English students, because of the 100 Years' War, were no longer very welcome in the country. There were also lots of other universities that were in countries that were kind of developing national culture on their own, and so they preferred to make their youth studying there. For example, there had been historically lots of German students going into France, and now new universities were founded in Germany, so that they could simply satisfy that need locally. However, despite this contraction, it is a bit typical. This is not just of France. I mean, for the same reason, everybody seemed to travel less after the 14th century crisis, probably at much greater distances. Like, there was plenty of Europeans in China in the 13th century. After the end of the Pax Mongolica, everything shrank, but the Black Death. Again, powers became more kind of territorially compact on a local base. However, exactly perhaps because of this times more emotional take on life, also this greater mortality, this kind of fatalism, and kind of greater contrast between life and death, some taste for more kind of material activities, or some kind of leisure ones, increased, including, in fact, and we find this in 15th century French literature, the first time explicit expression of pleasure in travel. The idea that the grand tour, right? The idea of visiting different places, this considered there is a revival of classicism, so even the ancient Roman ruins are attracting to places like Rome, for example, not just for pilgrimage, for some kind of intellectual interest. There is properly also an elite that has now consolidated after the Jacquerie and its repression, like its place. They're ruling, it's the Ancien Regime, and these people are, as we've seen, very rich, also in relative terms richer than they had been before. Right? Perhaps I'm not sure whether in France, in absolute terms, but I mean the idea that compared to other people, you're richer than you were before, right? Thus, you have much more stuff, much more money to spend, right? In a way, after the 100 Years' War, the country had been more compacted. Thus, it had also been more pacified. So people wanted to travel in a way. They wanted to leave their problems behind, even at an aristocratic level for a while, given that gradually also chivalry is declining, right? There is a lot of tournaments internationally also hosted, so that people travel also for that reason. But there is not that kind of intensive military lifestyle for which noblemen literally spent their entire life on horseback during the season, from the 8th to the 13th century, because they had just to fight continuously. Right now, these are all militarily trained, they do go at war, etc., but everything is much more mediated. There are more commanders than just warriors, and they have, again, an ever greater role in politics and society, for which they're also facilitated in travel. Again, the bonnes villes de France are competing for hosting the king, and these are huge cities. There are all kind of more universally compacted now in the same kind of oligarchization of the regime fashion, to host unitarily the court for a while, and there are huge spectacles, and that is an attraction for lots of people, even for the commoners, the peasants, because it's a way to make the big festival, the big event, and to attract the attention, right? Before, the champagne fairs have declined, but it was in France a bit like the same thing. You found people coming from every country in Europe from a quite early age. We're talking about the 11th to 12th, not just the 13th century where there was the peak. And people talked, people knew each other, people kind of learned of other countries, learned other languages. There were people who, just even merchants, who settled permanently in some branches. At this point, they're bankers, actually. So everything has become very, very elite compared to the pre-14th century crisis times. So it's even higher. It's for less people numerically, but it's ever broader range, and there is kind of a Renaissance, kind of European awareness of its unity, right? That makes all these ideas becoming ever more organic, even just philologically. There is now the printing machine. There is, of course, a further homogenization of European culture, and more. In any case, this perhaps was the experiment. I don't know how easily it has gone. We can talk about other topics, by the way, such as pilgrimage, ships, shipping, trade routes. Today we didn't talk much about merchants, or in fact, just the means of transport. Well, something. But, I mean, where did people also go when they went abroad? And we can see this for different countries at a time. I think starting from France is interesting. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you, as always, greatly and heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.